let's have a chat about SCP versus IAM policies. What each of them are, what they do, what effect they can have over each other, where you would use them, and then we'll have a look at an IAM policy in action and then SCP policy in action as well. So let's jump right in. So an IAM policy, what is an IAM policy? IAM policy is a policy, it's operated at the principal level. There are two types of policies, identity-based policies and resource-based policies. Identity-based policies are obviously attached to an IAM user group or a role, whereas a resource policy is attached to an AWS resource, such as an S3 bucket. IAM policies can grant or deny permissions to perform actions to certain resources. So this means that an IAM policy, you can have an explicit deny or you can have explicit accept on different resources within AWS. So for example, you might have a policy where you allow access to, let's say, EC2 instances, or you and then you might deny access to an S3 bucket. Or you can even go very granular and allow or deny specific actions on specific resources as well. Policies can only apply to IAM users, groups, or roles. IAM policy cannot be attached to an organizational unit, and IAM policies can never restrict the root identity of the AWS account, meaning that you can't restrict or control any access that the root user has over an account using policies. So on the other side, we've got service control policies, or SCPs. So SCPs do not replace IAM policies, such that they do not provide actual permissions. So again, SCPs don't actually provide permissions, accepting or denied permissions to resources. They put a more of a control around what permissions can be applied by an IAM policy. SBC takes precedence over an IAM policy. So for example, if you had a user with full access to S3 in their IAM policy, but there was an SCP policy that was assigned to that account that had a deny on S3, then the user wouldn't be able to access S3. SCPs can be applied at the root of the organization or to an individual accounts in an OU. So whereas IAM policies are attached to users, groups, or roles, SCPs are used in conjunction with AWS organizations, in that you can assign SCPs to the root organization, which means that SCP control would be applied and would filter down across all the OUs and all the accounts in that organization, or you can assign SCPs to individual OUs that sit under that root organization, or you can also apply them to individual accounts. When you apply an SCP to an OU or an individual AWS account, you choose either whitelist or disable, blacklist, the specified AWS service. So basically you're choosing to either enable a service to be allowed to be used in an account, or you're disabling it, which means you're unable to use a particular service or a particular resource type in that account. So we'll jump across to the AWS console now and we'll have a look at this in action. So let's start off at the organization. So this is under organizations. This is in my master account. You can see we have the AWS accounts, we have services, policies, settings, etc. So under policies, this is where we enable our service control policies. So as we can see here, service control policies are enabled. So if we click in here, we can now see, so these are some default ones that are produced by Control Tower. So down here, I've created a custom managed policy called Demo EC2 policy. So if we have a look at this policy, we can see here that this policy is actually doing a deny on EC2 on run EC2 instances on all EC2 across all accounts, but it's saying only deny if it's anything that's not a T2 or a T3 instance. So this means that when you go to deploy an instance in an account, this policy will allow you to deploy a T2 or a T3 instance, but it won't allow you to deploy any other instance. And we'll see this in action because we'll test a user that's got full EC2 access, which generally means that you'd be able to deploy any instance you wanted. And we'll see how this service control policy then stops that. Okay, so inside my account that I've applied that policy to, I'm currently in as an admin user. So if we go to IAM, and we'll have a look at the user. So here's my developer user, good old user one. So if we have a look at user one has a developer policy applied to it. That policy, if we have a look here, is allowing full access to EC2 on all resources. So in theory, if there wasn't any other control in place, this permission will allow it to do any task it wanted within the EC2. But because we've got that SCP policy applied to this, in theory, it should allow us to only spin up the T2 or T3 instances. Okay, so we're now logged into the demo account. As you can see, we're logged in as the user one user. So let's go to EC2. All right, now remembering that this user has full EC2 access, has an IAM policy that's allowing full EC2 access. Let's try and launch an instance. Okay, so I want to launch a C1 instance type. So we'll select C1. We'll go into choose demo key pair and we'll launch instance. Okay, look at that. So even though the instance launch has failed, so even though this user has an IAM policy that's allowing full EC2 access, the SCP or the service control policy that's been applied to this account at the organization level is only allowing the use of T2 or T3 instances. So when I try and launch a C type instance, I'm getting a deny on that. So if we go back to EC2 instance config, all right, so let's change this to one of the approved instances that the SCP policy has said. So we'll change it to, let's go to the top here. We'll put it to T2 micro. We'll launch the instance. And there you go, we now get a success. So that instance has now succeeded to launch because we're using one of the allowed instance types that was configured in the service control policy. All right, I hope you found that useful, and I'll talk to you next time.